Number 10. Meganeura. The dragonfly that shouldn't have been able to exist. In 1880, a French paleontologist named Charles Brongniart was sorting through fossil slabs pulled from a coal seam at Commentry in central France. The miners had been hauling up plant impressions for decades: ferns, horsetails, the standard botanical debris of the late Carboniferous. But on one particular slab, Brongniart found something that didn't belong in any insect catalog he'd ever read. The imprint stretched across the rock for nearly 70 centimeters. A wing. A single wing, longer than a man's forearm, veined like a dragonfly's, but on a scale that made no biological sense. He named it Meganeura monyi in 1885. The genus name means large-veined. The understatement is almost funny. Reconstructed wingspan estimates for Meganeura range from 65 to 75 centimeters. A related species, Meganeuropsis permiana, found in Kansas in 1939 by entomologist Frank Carpenter, pushed that figure to roughly 71 centimeters confirmed, with some specimens hinting at spans approaching 75. For perspective, that's wider than a bald eagle. A predatory insect with the wingspan of a small hawk, hunting through humid Carboniferous swamps roughly 300 million years ago. And here's the contradiction that kept entomologists arguing for a century. Modern insects have a hard ceiling on body size. They breathe through tracheae, passive tubes that diffuse oxygen directly into their tissues. Diffusion is a slow, distance-limited process. Scale up an insect's body, and the oxygen simply can't reach the deeper tissues fast enough. The biggest beetles today max out at around 16 centimeters. Anything larger should suffocate from the inside. So how did a dragonfly the size of a crow fly? In 1995, paleobiologist John Harrison and atmospheric chemist Robert Berner reconstructed the answer. Berner's geocarb models, refined through the 2000s, showed that during the late Carboniferous, atmospheric oxygen concentration spiked to roughly 35%. Compared to the 21% we breathe today. Massive coal forest ecosystems, dominated by lycopod trees and choking with undecayed plant matter, were pumping oxygen into the atmosphere faster than any biological process could consume it. The air itself was different, denser, richer. A flame held in that atmosphere would have burned hotter and faster. A spark in the wrong patch of damp leaf litter could ignite a forest. In that air, the diffusion ceiling lifted. Tracheae could supply tissue across a body span that modern oxygen levels simply cannot sustain. Meganeura wasn't an evolutionary anomaly. It was a direct consequence of atmospheric chemistry. What it hunted is the part that gets under your skin. Carboniferous swamps were full of soft-bodied amphibians, smaller insects, and early reptiles no longer than a human hand. Meganeura's mandibles, preserved in compression fossils, show serrated cutting edges. Modern dragonflies hunt on the wing. They intercept prey in midair with a strike rate above 95%, the highest of any predator on Earth. Scale that hunting behavior up to a 70-centimeter wingspan, and you have something that didn't pluck mosquitoes from the air. It plucked vertebrates. Imagine the sound. A modern dragonfly's wing beat produces a dry, papery rattle, audible from a few meters away. Meganeura's wings, 4 of them, beating through dense Carboniferous air, would have produced a low, mechanical hum, closer to the rotor wash of a small drone than an insect. You would have heard it before you saw it. The shadow would have crossed the leaf litter half a second before the strike. The Commentry coal seams preserve more than just wings. Sediment layers around the fossils show charred plant material, evidence of the recurrent forest fires that hyperoxic atmospheres produce. Meganeura lived in a world that was constantly, slowly burning. The smell of wet rot, sulfur from coal-forming peat, and wood smoke would have hung over those swamps permanently. The temperature, modeled from leaf stomata density, ran several degrees warmer than modern equatorial conditions, with humidity near saturation. When oxygen levels collapsed at the end of the Carboniferous, Meganeura collapsed with them. The Permian extinction finished what atmospheric chemistry started. Nothing of its size has flown since. What's unsettling about Meganeura isn't that it was a giant insect. It's what it proves. The boundaries we treat as laws of biology, maximum body size, oxygen tolerance, the upper limit of what can fly, aren't laws at all. They're conditions. Change the atmosphere, and the rules change with it. For 60 million years, an insect with the wingspan of a hawk patrolled forests that no longer exist, breathing air that no longer exists, hunting prey in a world whose physics differed from ours in measurable ways. Meganeura didn't evolve to be terrifying. It evolved to fit a planet that was running on different settings. Number 9. Arthropleura, the 2-meter millipede that walked through the same forests. The first complete fossil came out of a Scottish quarry in 2018, but the full reconstruction wasn't published until 2021. Geologist Neil Davies of the University of Cambridge was leading a team along the Northumberland coast when a chunk of sandstone cliff collapsed onto the beach near Howick. Inside the broken slab, exposed for the first time in 326 million years, was a fossilized exoskeleton segment 75 centimeters long. From a single segment of an arthropod's body, the animal it came from, when reconstructed, measured approximately 2.6 meters from head to tail. It weighed an estimated 50 kilograms. It was a millipede. Arthropleura had been known from partial fragments since the 1850s, when it was first described by German paleontologist Hermann Jordan. But the Howick specimen, combined with trackway fossils preserved in Nova Scotia and the Joggins Cliffs of Canada, finally settled the size question. Arthropleura was the largest land invertebrate that has ever existed, larger than any spider, scorpion, crab, or insect before or since. A millipede longer than a grown man and heavier than a Doberman. The trackways are what make it real. Walk the Joggins Cliffs at low tide, and you can still see them. Parallel rows of impressions pressed into ancient mudflats, each track 50 centimeters wide, the gait pattern showing dozens of legs moving in synchronized waves. Arthropleura didn't slither. It walked, deliberately, through the leaf litter of the same Carboniferous forests where Meganeura hunted overhead. The two animals shared a world. For decades, paleontologists assumed Arthropleura was a predator. Something that large had to eat meat. The assumption was wrong. Coprolite analysis, fossilized droppings, recovered from Arthropleura habitats, and isotope studies of preserved gut contents published in 2021 showed something unexpected. The droppings contained fern spores, lycopod fragments, and pollen. No animal tissue, no bone fragments, no insect chitin. Arthropleura was a detritivore. It ate plants, rotting wood, and forest floor debris. The same diet as a modern garden millipede, scaled up by a factor of several hundred, which somehow makes it worse. A predator that size makes evolutionary sense. Predators need biomass and territory, and a 2.6-meter hunter implies abundant prey. But a herbivore that size implies something else entirely. That the Carboniferous forests produced so much rotting plant matter, so continuously, that an animal weighing 50 kilograms could sustain itself on the floor litter alone. The decomposer niche in those swamps was so productive that it grew its own monsters. The reason traces back to the same atmospheric anomaly that built Meganeura. Hyperoxic air at 35% oxygen lifted the metabolic ceiling for arthropods across the board. But Arthropleura had a second advantage: lignin. The lycopod trees of the Carboniferous produced massive quantities of woody tissue. But the fungi and bacteria that decompose lignin today hadn't fully evolved yet. Wood accumulated. Forests buried themselves in their own dead matter. That's why the Carboniferous left behind the world's coal seams, billions of tons of plant material that simply couldn't rot. Arthropleura was one of the few organisms that could process it. The texture of its world is hard to imagine. The forest floor wasn't soil in any modern sense. It was a meters-deep mat of half-decomposed bark, fern fronds, and trunk debris, soaked with stagnant water, releasing methane and hydrogen sulfide as it slowly fermented. Walking through it would have felt like wading through wet sponge. The smell would have been overwhelming, sour, sulfurous, fungal. And through that mat, slowly, segment by segment, came an animal the length of a small car, its hundreds of legs cycling in precise sequence, mandibles working through rotting wood with a sound somewhere between a horse chewing hay and a paper shredder. Could it have hurt a human? Almost certainly. Modern millipedes secrete cyanide-laced defensive compounds from glands along their flanks. Scaled to Arthropleura's size, those secretions would have been toxic to anything within striking range. The animal didn't need to bite, it needed only to feel threatened. It vanished, like Meganeura, when oxygen levels collapsed at the end of the Carboniferous. The forests dried. The lignin barrier was finally breached by evolving fungi. The detritus mat thinned. By the early Permian, around 290 million years ago, Arthropleura was gone. What it leaves behind is the same uncomfortable question Meganeura raised. The size of land invertebrates we know today isn't a maximum. It's a minimum, set by the limited atmosphere we happen to live in. Somewhere in the layered rock of Northumberland, Nova Scotia, and Pennsylvania, the trackways of an animal that should not have been possible are preserved in stone, walking in slow, synchronized waves toward a world that ran out of air. Number 8. Pulmonoscorpius, the scorpion that learned to breathe air and grew to the size of a dog. In 1994, paleontologist Andrew Geram, working through the collections of the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, returned to a series of fossil fragments recovered from East Kirkton Quarry near Bathgate. The site had become legendary among Carboniferous specialists. Volcanic ash interbedded with lake sediments had preserved soft tissues at a level of detail almost unheard of in 330-million-year-old rock. Tracheae, eye lenses, muscle fibers. Among the slabs sat an arthropod that had been catalogued years earlier under a tentative label. When Geram reassembled the fragments and published the formal description, the measurement he reported stopped specialists mid-sentence: 70 centimeters. The animal was a scorpion 70 centimeters long, Pulmonoscorpius kirktonensis. The genus name translates as lung scorpion, a reference to the preserved respiratory structures that confirmed something earlier paleontologists had only suspected, that this species breathed atmospheric air through book lungs, the same architecture used by every modern terrestrial scorpion. It was not a marine giant flopping helplessly on a beach. It walked. It hunted. It lived its entire life on land. For comparison, the largest living scorpion, the African emperor Pandinus imperator, reaches roughly 23 centimeters at full maturity and weighs about 30 grams. Pulmonoscorpius dwarfed it by a factor of 3 in length and an estimated factor of 40 in mass. Reconstructions place its weight in the range of 4 to 5 kilograms, roughly the mass of a domestic cat. Stretched flat with metasoma extended, the animal was longer than a man's leg from hip to ankle. The size paradox returns to the same atmospheric anomaly that built Meganeura. During the late Visean stage of the early Carboniferous, atmospheric oxygen had already begun climbing toward the Permo-Carboniferous peak of 35%. Book lungs, like insect tracheae, rely partly on diffusion. Scale up the body, and oxygen delivery falters in a normal atmosphere. In Carboniferous air, the ceiling was simply higher. Pulmonoscorpius existed because the atmosphere allowed it to. What it ate is the question that turned debate sour for nearly 2 decades. The original interpretation, advanced by Jerram in 1993, held that an animal of this size must have been a vertebrate predator. Early tetrapods, small amphibian-like creatures roughly 30 to 50 centimeters long, shared the East Kirkton ecosystem. Reconstructions in textbooks throughout the 1990s and 2000s showed Pulmonoscorpius pinning struggling proto-amphibians beneath enormous pedipalps and driving its sting into their backs. The image was so visceral it became canonical. Then, in 2021, a reanalysis led by paleontologist Carolyn Haug at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich reopened the case. Comparative morphology of the chelicerae, the small mouthparts ahead of the larger claws, suggested they were too gracile for tearing vertebrate flesh. The grasping pedipalps, while large, lacked the robust crushing geometry seen in modern vertebrate-eating scorpions. The likeliest diet, Haug's team concluded, was other arthropods, cockroaches, centipedes, smaller scorpions, possibly the soft, early forms of Arthropleura's relatives. That refinement does not soften the picture. It sharpens it. Pulmonoscorpius hunted at the same trophic level as a modern badger, scaled into an exoskeleton with 8 legs, 8 eyes, and a venom-loaded tail held over its back like a cocked hammer. The toxicology cannot be reconstructed directly. Venom does not fossilize. But based on the size of the telson, the bulb at the tip of the metasoma, the venom gland would have been roughly the volume of a chicken egg. Modern scorpion venoms are neurotoxic cocktails refined to incapacitate prey within seconds. A reservoir that size, even with diluted potency, would have delivered a dose orders of magnitude beyond anything a human emergency room has ever processed. The world Pulmonoscorpius patrolled was strange in ways modern visitors would feel before they saw. East Kirkton itself was a hot spring complex on the margins of a tropical lake. Geothermal vents released sulfur compounds that hung in the air. The water was warm year-round, sometimes scalding. Volcanic ash falls dusted the vegetation periodically, leaving a fine grit on every leaf. Walking through it would have meant heat, sulfur, the metallic taste of mineralized humidity, and the sound of arthropod movement in the leaf litter. Not the small, papery rustle of a beetle, but the heavier mechanical click of chitin plates the size of dinner plates rotating against one another. Pulmonoscorpius would have moved slowly when not hunting. Modern scorpions are ambush predators, conserving energy between strikes. Most of its life was spent motionless beneath logs, beneath the curling fronds of tree-sized lycopods, waiting. The strike, when it came, would have been almost too fast to track. Modern scorpions complete the full cycle of detection, grasp, and sting in under 200 milliseconds. Scaled up, the geometry changes, but the timing does not. What stays with you is not the size, it's the breathing. Tracheal preservation at East Kirkton confirms Pulmonoscorpius drew air through book lungs in steady cycles, just as living scorpions do. There was nothing alien about its biology. It was the same architecture you can find under any rock in the Sahara today, scaled into a body that should not have been physically possible. The blueprint never changed, only the atmosphere did. And when the oxygen fell, this version of the design simply could not be built anymore. The scorpion you would step on in a desert tonight is the surviving descendant of a lineage that once stood eye level with your knee. Number 7. Jaekelopterus. The aquatic predator larger than a human being. In November 2007, biologist Simon Brady at the University of Bristol published a single photograph that recalibrated everything paleontologists thought they knew about the upper limits of arthropod size. The image showed a fossil claw recovered from a 390 million-year-old Devonian quarry near Prüm in western Germany. The claw was 46 centimeters long, just the claw. Working backward through standard body-to-appendage ratios established for related species, Brady and his colleague Marcus Poschmann calculated the total length of the animal that had owned that claw at approximately 2.5 meters. Some estimates pushed toward 2.6. The species was named Jaekelopterus rhenaniae after Otto Jaekel, the German paleontologist who first described related forms a century earlier. For perspective, Jaekelopterus was longer than a fully grown human being. It was longer than a Bengal tiger. It was the largest arthropod that has ever existed on Earth, surpassing even Arthropleura's terrestrial bulk when measured by body length, and operating in an environment where speed and acceleration mattered far more than they did on a carboniferous forest floor. It was a sea scorpion, a eurypterid, and it ruled freshwater rivers and brackish estuaries during the early to middle Devonian, a period when vertebrate fish were still developing the body plans that would later dominate the seas. The claw itself is the part that should not exist. Modern crustacean claws, lobsters, crabs, mantis shrimp, operate with serious force, but they are constrained by exoskeleton mechanics. A claw that long should snap under its own leverage. Jaekelopterus solved the engineering problem with a denticulated cutting edge, rows of inward curving spikes along both inner surfaces, configured for shearing rather than crushing. Prey caught between those rows was not held, it was sliced open. The bite mechanics, modeled by paleontologist Russell Bicknell at the University of New England in 2022, suggest a closing force well into the range associated with modern alligators. The difference is the geometry. An alligator distributes that force across a long jaw. Jaekelopterus concentrated it across the contact points of those denticles, producing localized pressures comparable to industrial cutting tools. A human leg caught in that grip would not have been broken. It would have been severed. Sensory anatomy points to a hunter that operated in turbid water by visual ambush. Two large compound eyes mounted forward on the carapace gave Jaekelopterus stereoscopic vision, depth perception, the same neurological gift that allows a hawk to gauge a strike. Most arthropods lack true stereopsis. Eurypterids of this size apparently evolved it independently, in the rivers of what is now Rhineland-Palatinate, hundreds of millions of years before the first primates assembled the feature in mammals. What Jaekelopterus hunted is preserved in the same Hunsrück slate deposits that produced the type specimen. Placoderm fish, armored predators in their own right, some up to a meter long. Smaller eurypterids. The soft-bodied arthropods crowding the muddy river bottoms. The Hunsrück preserves wounds. Some placoderm specimens carry parallel gashes across their armor plates that match the spacing of Jaekelopterus denticles almost exactly. The animal was eating fish that wore bone-like body armor and finding ways through that armor to the meat beneath. Its movement was not the slow scuttle of a modern crayfish. The body of a eurypterid was built for thrust. A broad, paddle-shaped sixth pair of appendages, modified into swimming oars, drove the animal forward in surges. The tail, terminating in a flattened telson, provided steering and stability. Jaekelopterus was capable of lunging strikes from concealment in submerged vegetation, covering several meters in a single contraction. Imagine standing waist-deep in a Devonian river. The water is brackish, stained brown by tannins from rotting vegetation upstream. Visibility is perhaps an arm's length. You feel the current shift around your legs. You see nothing until the claws are already closed. The temperature of that river would have been warm. Devonian Germany sat near the equator. The smell would have been organic and sour. The iron tang of brackish water mixed with the rot of fern litter on the banks. The sound, if Jaekelopterus moved nearby, would have been almost nothing. Eurypterids swam efficiently. The only signature was a low pressure wave passing through the water against the skin, and by the time you registered it, the claws had already arrived. The eurypterid lineage did not collapse from a single catastrophe. It was outcompeted, slowly, across tens of millions of years. The same Devonian rivers where Jaekelopterus hunted were filling with increasingly capable jawed fish. By the late Devonian, gnathostomes, the vertebrate jawbearers, had radiated into ecological roles eurypterids had previously dominated. Speed, sensory acuity, and metabolic efficiency tipped against the arthropods. By the end of the Permian, the lineage was gone entirely. The disturbing thing about Jaekelopterus is what it implies about evolutionary ceilings. Arthropods today max out in marine environments at the Japanese spider crab, about 3.7 meters in leg span, but only a few kilograms in body mass. Jaekelopterus had an actual body 2.5 meters long, weighing perhaps 90 kilograms, all muscle and chitin and cutting edge. The architecture supports that scale. The blueprint allows it. What stops modern arthropods from reaching it is a combination of oxygen levels, vertebrate competition, and 250 million years of evolutionary pressure pushing them in other directions. Remove those constraints, and the design is still viable. The largest predator ever built by the arthropod lineage is not a relic of impossible biology. It is a relic of conditions that no longer exist. The body plan is still walking around in your shrimp cocktail. It just got smaller. Number 6. Dunkleosteus. The armored fish that bit harder than a tyrannosaur. In 1873, an amateur fossil hunter named J. Terrell was walking along the cliffs of Sheffield Lake on the southern shore of Lake Erie in Ohio when he noticed something massive weathering out of the black shale. The rock was Cleveland Shale, late Devonian, roughly 360 million years old. What Terrell extracted and what his son later helped excavate over the following decades was a skull. Just a skull. It measured well over a meter from front to back. There were no teeth in the conventional sense. Instead, the jaws terminated in vast, self-sharpening blades of bone, hinged together like the cutting edges of industrial shears. The animal was named Dunkleosteus terrelli, after both the family that recovered it and David Dunkel, the Cleveland Museum curator who later formalized the genus. For more than a century, paleontologists portrayed it as a leviathan. Total body length estimates of 6 to 9 meters, mass estimates as high as 4 tons. A monster fish patrolling the Devonian seas with armor plating the thickness of a thumb. In 2023, paleontologist Russell Engelman at Case Western Reserve University published a recalibration in the journal Diversity that altered the dimensions but somehow made the animal more disturbing, not less. By comparing skull-to-body ratios across living Arthrodairy's closest analogs and reanalyzing fragmentary postcranial material, Engelman concluded that adult Dunkleosteus probably measured 3.4 to 4.1 meters in length, not 9. Its body was shorter, stockier, more bulldog than torpedo. The estimate cut its length nearly in half. Compress 4 tons of muscle and armor into a 3.5 meter frame, and you do not get a smaller animal. You get a tank. Only the head and shoulder armor of Dunkleosteus fossilized. The body was cartilaginous, similar in tissue composition to a modern shark, and decomposed without leaving impressions in most depositional environments. What survived is the part you would have wanted to survive least to encounter. The craniothoracic shield, a fused mosaic of dermal bone plates encasing the head and the front third of the body. The plates are sometimes 5 centimeters thick. Inside that helmet sat one of the most efficient bite mechanisms ever assembled by natural selection. In 2007, biomechanists Philip Anderson and Mark Westneat at the University of Chicago published a finite element analysis of the Dunkleosteus skull in the journal Biology Letters. Their model produced numbers that have not been seriously challenged since. The animal's bite force at the tip of its blade-like fangs reached approximately 6,000 newtons. Distributed across the cusp surfaces during a closing strike, localized pressures climbed past 80 megapascals. That places Dunkleosteus among the most powerful biters in the history of vertebrate life, comparable to a large saltwater crocodile, and approaching the calculated bite forces of Tyrannosaurus rex. The mechanism that delivered that bite was equally sophisticated. Dunkleosteus possessed a 4-bar linkage in its skull. When it opened its mouth, the skull rotated upward while the lower jaw dropped, generating a suction effect that drew prey into the mouth at speeds reaching half a meter per second. The full open and strike cycle completed in approximately 20 milliseconds, faster than a human eye can track. The water displacement alone would have been enough to disorient prey before the blades even made contact. Coprolite evidence, fossilized droppings, recovered from the Cleveland Shale contains fragmented bone and armor plates from Dunkleosteus's prey. Some of those fragments come from other Dunkleosteus. The species was cannibalistic. Adults ate juveniles. Whether deliberate predation or opportunistic scavenging, the digestive remains tell a clear story. Nothing in the late Devonian seas, including its own kind, was safe from this animal. The seas Dunkleosteus patrolled looked nothing like modern oceans. The late Devonian was a period of high sea levels and warm, shallow epicontinental seas covering much of what are now central North America, Morocco, and Eastern Europe. Visibility in those waters varied from clear to murky. The Cleveland Shale itself preserves anoxic bottom conditions. The depositional environment was a stratified sea where oxygenated surface waters sat above a dead, sulfide-rich deep zone. Dunkleosteus hunted in the upper layers where light penetrated and other large fish congregated. Imagine the conditions. Warm tropical water, sometimes clouded with plankton, sometimes carrying the metallic taste of iron upwelling from below. The smell of decay near the surface where dead fish accumulated. A constant low-frequency pulse of large bodies moving through the water. Sharks already existed, but they were smaller, faster, more cautious. Dunkleosteus was the apex. Other fish moved out of its way the moment it entered a shoal. Those that did not survive the encounter. The strike itself would have been almost silent. Suction-based predation produces a brief inrush of water rather than the explosive cavitation of a slamming bite. The prey simply vanished, pulled into the mouth, sheared into pieces by the bone shears, swallowed before any defensive response could be mounted. Then nothing. The water settled. The armored shape continued past, looking for the next target. Dunkleosteus and its arthrodire relatives went extinct at the end of the Devonian, in the Hagenberg event, roughly 358 million years ago. A global oxygen crash and biotic crisis that wiped out approximately 50% of vertebrate genera. The lineage of placoderms, the armored fishes that had dominated the seas for 70 million years, ended completely. Not a single placoderm survived into the Carboniferous. The lineage left no descendants. What that means is rare in evolutionary history. Most extinct groups have living relatives. Sister branches, evolutionary offshoots, distant cousins. Placoderms have none. The body plan was tested for tens of millions of years, refined into one of the most successful predatory designs the oceans ever produced, and then deleted. Permanently. Whatever Dunkleosteus was doing right, the planet stopped tolerating it. The shears closed for the last time, and the helmet sank into the mud, and a 70 million year experiment in armored predation ended without leaving a forwarding address. Number 5. Titanoboa, the snake the size of a city bus. In 2002, geologists from the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute began surveying an open-pit coal mine called Cerrejón in the Guajira Peninsula of northern Colombia. The pit cuts down through 60 million-year-old sediments, Paleocene, the period immediately following the asteroid impact that ended the dinosaurs. Working through fossil leaves and turtle shells, the team began recovering vertebrae. Large vertebrae. Larger than they should have been. In 2009, paleontologist Jason Head of the University of Toronto, Mississauga, working with collaborators from the Smithsonian and the Florida Museum of Natural History, published the formal description in Nature. The species was named Titanoboa cerrejonensis. reconstructed length based on vertebral proportions calibrated against modern boids, 12.8 meters, with a margin extending to nearly 14. Estimated mass, 1,135 kilograms. A snake longer than a school bus, heavier than a small car, and, critically, built like a constrictor. The size paradox is what made Titanoboa scientifically transformative. Modern snakes have hard upper limits on body size, and those limits are set largely by ambient temperature. Snakes are ectotherms. Their metabolism, their muscle function, their ability to digest large prey all depend on environmental heat. A snake the size of Titanoboa would require a sustained mean annual temperature of approximately 30 to 34 degrees Celsius to survive. That is hotter than any modern tropical environment on Earth. The Amazon basin today averages around 26 to 28 degrees. Titanoboa's existence is therefore evidence of a Paleocene tropics significantly hotter than today's. The reconstruction inverted a long-running scientific assumption. For decades, climatologists had argued that equatorial temperatures hit a thermal ceiling, that even during global hothouse periods, the tropics stayed roughly the same, and the warming was concentrated at the poles. Titanoboa demolished that assumption. The tropics had been hotter, substantially hotter. And one of the consequences was that reptiles grew to sizes the modern world cannot support. The Sarcosuchus Formation preserves more than the snake. It preserves the entire ecosystem Titanoboa hunted in. Giant freshwater turtles with shells over a meter across. Crocodiliforms, early relatives of modern crocodiles, reaching 4 meters in length. Lungfish more than 3 meters long. The food web was scaled up across the board. The largest predator of that food web was the snake. Skull fragments recovered in 2011 confirmed the diet. Titanoboa's jaw morphology and tooth shape match those of modern aquatic snakes that specialize in fish. Anacondas hunting in flooded forests, for example. Despite its size, Titanoboa was probably not primarily a land hunter. It was a river ambusher, a semi-aquatic constrictor that lay in shallow channels of the Great Deltaic System that covered northern South America during the Paleocene, waiting for fish, turtles, and crocodiliforms to pass within range. A constriction strike from an animal that size would have been final. Constrictors do not crush their prey by squeezing the air out. That is a persistent myth. They tighten in coordinated pulses with each exhalation of the prey, raising pressure inside the prey's body cavity until the heart cannot fill and circulation collapses. Death comes by ischemia in roughly 30 seconds for most prey. For something the size of a 4-meter crocodiliform, the process might have taken minutes. The cardiovascular pressure Titanoboa generated has been estimated conservatively at over 400 millimeters of mercury, multiple times the pressure required to stop a human heart. The world Titanoboa inhabited would have been almost unbearable to a modern human. Mean annual temperatures of 32 degrees Celsius. Humidity near saturation year-round. Atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, possibly 2 to 3 times pre-industrial levels, contributing to the heat. The Sarcosuchus environment was a vast lowland rainforest threaded with broad, slow-moving rivers, periodically flooded across thousands of square kilometers. The smell would have been overwhelming. Wet vegetation, decay, the particular sourness of stagnant fresh water. The sound? A constant low drone of insects, the splashes of large fish, and occasionally the displacement of water as something very large changed position in the channel. The visual texture is perhaps the strangest part. Titanoboa was probably dark, possibly mottled to break up its outline against the muddy substrate. At rest in shallow water, only the upper third of its body would have broken the surface, a long, ridged shape resembling a half-submerged log. The closest modern analog is the green anaconda, which reaches 5 to 6 meters and weighs perhaps 90 kilograms. Scale that morphology by a factor of 12 in mass, and the result is something a human standing on a riverbank would not recognize as an animal until it moved. Titanoboa survived in those tropics for as long as the climate sustained it. Cooling through the late Paleocene and into the Eocene gradually pulled tropical temperatures below the threshold needed to support its metabolism. The lineage shrank. By the time temperatures stabilized at modern values, the giants were gone. The largest snakes alive today, reticulated pythons and green anacondas, top out at roughly half Titanoboa's length and a tenth of its mass. The implication is uncomfortable to sit with. The upper limit of snake size is not a fixed evolutionary ceiling. It is a thermostat reading. Push tropical temperatures back up to Paleocene levels, something climate models suggest is achievable within the next few centuries under sustained emissions, and the architecture that built Titanoboa is still latent in the genome of every modern boid. The snake itself is gone. The blueprint is not. It is waiting for the temperature to come back. Number 4. Sarcosuchus, the crocodile that ate dinosaurs for breakfast. In 1964, a French paleontological expedition led by Albert Félix de Lapparent was working in the Tenere Desert of northern Niger, surveying Cretaceous sandstones in a region called Gadufaua. The site is one of the richest dinosaur graveyards in Africa. Among the bones of long-necked sauropods and predatory theropods, the team began recovering fragments of a skull that did not match any dinosaur. The shape was wrong. The teeth were conical and recurved. The snout was elongated, ridged along the top, terminating in a strange bulbous expansion at the tip. It was a crocodile, but the skull alone measured 1.6 meters in length. The species was formally named Sarcosuchus imperator, the flesh crocodile emperor, and for decades it remained known mostly from fragmentary material. Then, in 1997 and 2000, a team led by paleontologist Paul Sereno of the University of Chicago returned to Gadufaua and recovered nearly complete skeletons. The full reconstruction stunned even specialists who thought they understood crocodilomorph evolution. Total length, 11 to 12 meters. Estimated mass, 8 tons. The animal was longer than a city bus and weighed as much as an adult African elephant. For comparison, the largest living crocodile, the saltwater crocodile of northern Australia and Southeast Asia, reaches a verified maximum of approximately 6.3 meters and 1.2 tons. Sarcosuchus was nearly twice as long and roughly 7 times heavier. It lived 110 million years ago in the early Cretaceous, in the river systems that drained what is now the Sahara, when the Sahara was a vast green floodplain. The bulbous structure at the tip of the snout, the bulla, is one of the strangest features in vertebrate paleontology. No living crocodile has anything like it. Internal CT scanning conducted by Sereno's team revealed that the bulla was hollow, lined with thin bone, and connected to the nasal passages. The most likely function was acoustic. Sarcosuchus may have used the chamber as a resonator, producing low-frequency calls that traveled through water and air far more efficiently than the simpler vocalizations of modern crocodiles. The animal may have communicated across kilometers of river system through deep, rumbling notes felt in the chest before they were heard in the ear. The teeth tell a different story than modern crocodile teeth. A saltwater crocodile has roughly 66 conical teeth, all built for gripping and holding. Sarcosuchus had 132. The arrangement was rows of recurved fangs near the front, transitioning to thicker, more robust teeth toward the back. The geometry suggests a generalist predator capable of seizing both fish and large terrestrial prey. Bite force estimates calculated from skull mechanics by paleontologist Greg Erickson and colleagues, place Sarcosuchus's jaw closure at approximately 80,000 newtons, roughly twice the bite force of a saltwater crocodile, and comparable to the calculated bite of Tyrannosaurus rex. What it ate is preserved in the same Gadufaua sediments that produced the type specimens. Sauropod dinosaurs, iguanodonts, large fish, coelacanths up to 4 meters long, some of which still survive in modified form in the deep waters off Madagascar. Sarcosuchus was the apex predator of its river system, and apex in this context means it ate dinosaurs. Bite marks consistent with Sarcosuchus tooth spacing have been documented on sauropod limb bones recovered from the same formation. The pattern suggests ambush attacks at the water's edge, the same hunting strategy modern Nile crocodiles use against wildebeest, scaled up against animals weighing 20 tons. The hunting environment was a network of broad, sluggish rivers winding through a landscape of conifer forests and fern prairies. The climate was hot and seasonally wet, monsoon-driven, with prolonged dry seasons that concentrated animals around shrinking water sources. The smell along those riverbanks would have been the layered organic stink of any tropical wetland. Rotting vegetation, fish carcasses, the ammoniacal sharpness of reptile droppings drying on exposed mud. The temperature of the water in the dry season would have hovered in the low 30s Celsius. The texture of the riverbanks, cracked clay near the surface, soft black mud below, churned by the trails of large reptiles entering and leaving the water. A Sarcosuchus ambush would have lasted seconds. The animal floated low in the water, only the eyes and the tip of the bulla visible. Sauropods drinking at the river's edge represented predictable, repeatable targets. The strike came laterally, a 12-meter body accelerating from rest into shore in a single muscular surge, jaws opening to engulf a leg or the lower torso of a drinking animal, then retreating into deep water. The death roll, a maneuver still used by modern crocodiles to dismember large prey, would have generated rotational forces capable of tearing limbs from sauropod bodies. Sarcosuchus did not need to swallow its kills whole. It needed only to drag them under and wait for drowning to do the work. Growth ring analysis of Sarcosuchus osteoderms, the bony plates embedded in the skin along the back, produced one of the most surprising findings of the Serino study. Sarcosuchus took 50 to 60 years to reach full adult size. Modern crocodiles mature in 10 to 15. The Cretaceous giant grew slowly, lived long, and continued increasing in size throughout much of its life. The largest individuals recovered may not have been the largest possible. They were simply the oldest individuals that happened to die in places where their bones could fossilize. The lineage of Sarcosuchus did not survive to the end of the Cretaceous. Climate shifts and the gradual drying of the African interior reduced the river systems that supported it. By 95 million years ago, the genus had vanished. The crocodilomorph lineage continued and eventually produced the modern crocodiles and alligators, but the body plan that allowed an 11-meter river ambusher to terrorize sauropods was never reproduced. Modern crocodiles approach the design but never reach it. The disturbing implication is the proximity of the architecture. Sarcosuchus was not a strange experimental form. It was a crocodile. Its skeleton, scaled down, would be familiar to any modern herpetologist. The same skull, the same vertebral pattern, the same musculature. Increase the mean annual temperature, expand the river systems, remove the competition from large mammalian carnivores, and the design works again. The thing that prevents a Sarcosuchus from existing today is not biology. It is geography and temperature, and the mammals that took the niches it once occupied. Remove those obstacles and the river is full again. Number 3. Megalodon, the shark that hunted whales. In 1667, the Danish anatomist Niels Stensen, known to history as Nicolaus Steno, was dissecting the head of a great white shark in Florence, Italy, when he made a connection that would establish the foundations of paleontology. The triangular objects locals called tungstones, found embedded in the rocks of Malta and Tuscany, matched the teeth he was extracting from the shark. They were not stones, they were teeth. Fossilized teeth. Some of them were enormous. Steno's identification was correct, but the implications took another 2 centuries to develop. The teeth he saw belonged to Ototus megalodon, formally classified, described, and named in the 19th century by Swiss naturalist Louis Agassiz. Some specimens measured 18 centimeters along the diagonal, triangle-shaped, serrated along both edges, thicker at the base than a man's thumb. The largest teeth ever recovered from any animal, living or extinct. The size of the animal that grew them has been recalculated repeatedly. The most recent estimates, published by Jack Cooper of Swansea University and colleagues in 2020 and refined in 2024, place adult megalodon at 15 to 20 meters in length, with mass estimates from 60 to 100 tons. The largest individuals may have approached 24 meters. For comparison, the largest verified great white shark on record measured 7 meters and weighed roughly 3.5 tons. Megalodon was 3 times longer and up to 30 times heavier than the largest predatory shark alive today. It was the largest macro-predatory fish in the history of life on Earth. The bite force estimates are difficult to absorb. A 2008 study by Stephen Rowe of the University of New South Wales, using finite element analysis of reconstructed jaw mechanics, calculated Megalodon's bite force at between 108,000 and 182,000 newtons. The upper end of that range is roughly 10 times the bite force of a great white, and approximately 3 times the bite force estimated for Tyrannosaurus rex. The teeth themselves were over-engineered for the task. Serration analysis shows microscopic blade-like edges on each cusp, capable of slicing through cetacean blubber and muscle with minimal resistance. What Megalodon ate is preserved on the bones of its victims. Whale ribs, vertebrae, and skull fragments from late Miocene and Pliocene deposits, particularly the Calvert Cliffs of Maryland and the Pisco Formation of Peru, carry tooth marks that match Megalodon dentition exactly. Some specimens show wounds that healed, indicating the whale survived the attack. Most do not. The pattern suggests Megalodon targeted the ribcage and flippers of medium-sized baleen whales, immobilizing them through massive blood loss before consuming the carcass. A 2022 study published in Science Advances and led by Jack Cooper used 3D modeling of a near-complete vertebral column to estimate that Megalodon could have consumed prey up to 8 meters long in as few as 5 bites. A modern killer whale takes hours to fully consume a similar carcass. Megalodon ate on a different timescale. Its stomach capacity, modeled from body proportions, exceeded 9,600 liters. It could have processed the entire body of a small whale in a single feeding event. The hunting strategy is reconstructed from comparative biomechanics with modern lamniform sharks. Megalodon was almost certainly a fast attack predator using a vertical strike from below, accelerating from depth into the unprotected belly of a surface-swimming whale, breaching partially out of the water with the prey already in its jaws. Modern great whites use the same approach against seals. Scale the technique up by a factor of 30 in body mass, and the result is a strike that lifts a 10-ton whale clear of the water and tears it open before the prey even registers the attack. The oceans Megalodon patrolled were warmer than modern oceans by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius across most of its range. The species had a near-global distribution. Fossil teeth have been recovered from every continent except Antarctica, on every coastline that preserved Miocene marine sediments. The water at the surface would have been roughly the temperature of a warm bath in low latitudes. Visibility, variable. The sound environment of those seas was different from today's. Fewer fishing vessels, no propeller noise, but louder biological signals from larger and more numerous cetaceans. Whales communicating across hundreds of kilometers. The deep, percussive thuds of sperm whales clicking into the abyss. And occasionally, the silence that fell when something very large passed through a pod. The sensory experience of being prey is partially reconstructible. Whales attacked by Megalodon would have felt nothing until impact. The strike came from below and behind, outside the visual field of a surface-swimming cetacean. The pressure wave preceding the attack might have given the whale a fraction of a second of warning, no more. The bite itself, at 100,000 plus newtons, would have produced impact forces equivalent to a small vehicle collision. The prey was lifted, torn, and dropped, often in a single motion. Blood plumes from successful Megalodon strikes would have been visible from kilometers away, drawing scavengers, smaller sharks, other megalodons, eventually the soft-bodied invertebrates of the deep. Megalodon went extinct approximately 3.6 million years ago in the late Pliocene. The cause was not a single catastrophe. Multiple factors converged. Global cooling shrank the warm water habitats Megalodon depended on. The closure of the Central American Seaway altered ocean circulation patterns. Most critically, the baleen whale species Megalodon had specialized in hunting were undergoing their own evolutionary shift toward larger body sizes and migrations into cold polar waters that Megalodon's metabolism could not follow. The shark was a tropical specialist. The whales moved out of the tropics. The connection between predator and prey broke. There was also competition. Recent isotopic studies, published in 2022 by Robert Bosenecker and colleagues, found significant dietary overlap between Megalodon and the rising killer whale lineage. Orcas hunt cooperatively. Megalodon almost certainly did not. A pack of intelligent, coordinated predators outcompeted the solitary giant in the same way wolves outcompete solitary big cats in modern ecosystems. The largest shark in history was outmaneuvered by an animal 1/10 its size, hunting in groups. The lineage left no descendants. Otodus megalodon was the last representative of an entire shark family, the Otodontidae, that had dominated marine predation for 23 million years. When the species ended, the family ended. Modern great whites are not direct descendants. They are a parallel lineage, smaller, faster, occupying a different evolutionary trajectory. What sits with you about Megalodon is not the size, it is the recency. The dinosaurs vanished 66 million years ago. Megalodon was still hunting whales when the first members of the genus Australopithecus were walking upright in East Africa. Our ancestors and this animal overlapped in time on the same planet. The teeth coming out of Pliocene cliffs are not relics from an alien Earth. They are relics from the world that produced us. The shark was already going extinct when our lineage was learning to make stone tools. We arrived just in time to inherit oceans it had recently emptied. Number 2. Livyatan melvillei, the sperm whale that hunted other whales. In November 2008, paleontologist Klaas Post of the Natural History Museum of Rotterdam was on the final day of an expedition through the Pisco Ica Desert of southern Peru when he noticed teeth weathering out of a sandstone outcrop in the Pisco Formation. The rocks were Miocene, roughly 9.9 million years old. The teeth were enormous, over 36 centimeters long and 12 centimeters in diameter at the base. They were the largest functional biting teeth ever recovered from any animal, living or extinct. The skull was excavated over the following months and shipped to Lima for preparation. When the description was published in Nature in 2010, the international team, Olivier Lambert, Giovanni Bianucci, Klaas Post, and colleagues, gave the species a name that captured what the discovery represented. The genus was Livyatan, the Hebrew transliteration of Leviathan. The species name honored Herman Melville, author of Moby Dick. Livyatan melvillei, the killer sperm whale. The skull alone measured 3 meters in length. Total body length, calculated from skull-to-body ratios in modern sperm whales, came in at 13.5 to 17.5 meters. Estimated mass, 57 tons. Livyatan was roughly the same length as a modern adult male sperm whale, but built along radically different lines. Where the living sperm whale carries an enormous spermaceti organ in its forehead and uses it primarily for echolocation, and possibly for ramming, Leviathan was a predator. Pure predator. The skull was reinforced for biting. The teeth were arranged in both upper and lower jaws. Modern sperm whales have functional teeth only in the lower jaw, and they interlocked along the entire length of the mouth. This is the critical anatomical distinction. A modern sperm whale dives to crushing depths and hunts giant squid by suction feeding. The teeth are essentially vestigial. The animal swallows its prey whole. Leviathan was the inverse. Its teeth were the largest in the animal kingdom by every meaningful measure. Longer than the teeth of T-Rex, thicker than the teeth of Megalodon, designed to interlock and shear in unison. The bite mechanics of Leviathan have not been modeled with the same precision as Megalodon's, but the comparative anatomy makes the function unambiguous. This was an animal built to bite into other large animals and tear them apart. What it ate is preserved in the same Pisco formation that produced the type specimen. Medium-sized baleen whales, 7 to 10 meters long, populate the same sediments as Livyatan, sometimes literally meters from the predator's bones. Some of those whale skeletons carry damage consistent with attack by a large macropredator. The size match is too clean to ignore. Livyatan was hunting baleen whales. The same niche, broadly, as modern killer whales, but at 5 times the body mass and with weaponry that would have made the engagement nearly instantaneous rather than prolonged. The temporal coincidence is what makes Livyatan's existence so disturbing. It lived in the same oceans at the same time as Megalodon. The Pisco Formation preserves Megalodon teeth in adjacent strata. 2 macro-predators of comparable mass hunting the same prey populations in the same warm late Miocene seas. There is no modern analog. No ocean today contains 2 apex predators of this scale operating simultaneously. The energetic requirements alone should have forced one to displace the other. Instead, they coexisted for several million years. How they avoided direct conflict is unknown. The leading hypothesis, advanced by Lambert and colleagues, suggests partial niche separation. Megalodon may have specialized in coastal and shelf environments, while Leviathan operated more in open pelagic waters. Or one species may have targeted juvenile whales, while the other took adults. The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. The reality may be that the late Miocene oceans were simply richer in cetacean prey than any modern ocean, supporting predator densities that would be impossible today. The hunting environment can be partially reconstructed. The Peruvian coast during the late Miocene was bordered by upwelling zones, cold, nutrient-rich water rising from the depths and supporting massive plankton blooms. Those blooms fed schools of small fish, which fed seabirds and seals, which in turn supported populations of small to medium cetaceans. Above all of it, in the warm surface waters, Livyatan and Megalodon patrolled. The sounds beneath the waves would have been layered, the high-frequency clicks of dolphins, the longer moans of baleen whales, and underneath everything, the deep echolocation pulses of Livyatan itself. Sperm whale clicks today are among the loudest biological sounds on Earth, registering up to 230 decibels at the source. Livyatan, with a similarly large but possibly differently configured spermaceti organ, may have produced clicks of comparable power, used both for navigation and possibly for stunning prey at close range. The smell of those seas, if a human could have stood on a Miocene Peruvian beach, would have been heavy with marine organics, kelp, fish, the constant ammoniacal sharpness of guano on the offshore rocks. The water would have been cold near shore, warming rapidly into the open sea. Visibility in the upwelling zones was probably poor, clouded by plankton. A whale being hunted by Livyatan would have heard the clicks before it saw the predator. The strike, when it came, would have been almost too fast to register. A 50-ton body accelerating from depth, jaws opening to engulf the chest cavity of a 10-meter prey animal, teeth interlocking and tearing in a single motion. The prey was disabled in seconds. The feeding could continue for hours. Livyatan went extinct alongside Megalodon in the same set of late Miocene to early Pliocene environmental shifts. Cooling oceans, restructured circulation, migrating prey populations. The same factors that broke the Megalodon food web broke Livyatan's. By 5 million years ago, both species were gone. The macro-predator role they shared was inherited by no single species. It was distributed across killer whales, large sharks, and eventually, in human time, lost almost entirely as commercial whaling reduced the prey populations that had sustained those predators for tens of millions of years. What stays with you is the geometry of those teeth. They are housed today in the Natural History Museum of Lima. They sit in glass cases, dark with mineralization, longer than a human forearm. They were grown by an animal that hunted other whales for a living. Nothing in the modern oceans grows teeth like these. Nothing has needed to. The architecture is dormant, held in the genetic legacy of the sperm whale lineage, expressed in vestigial form in living species, but no longer activated. The blueprint for Livyatan is still encoded somewhere in the cetacean genome. It is simply no longer being read. Number 1. Quetzalcoatlus, the flying reptile the size of a fighter jet. In 1971, a graduate student named Douglas Lawson was surveying late Cretaceous sediments in Big Bend National Park in the Chihuahuan Desert of West Texas when he found a fragment of bone weathering out of a sandstone hillside. The fragment was hollow, characteristic of avian or pterosaurian anatomy, and unusually large. Excavation continued for several years. What Lawson and his advisor Juan Langston Jr. eventually recovered, and what subsequent fieldwork in the same formation expanded, was the partial skeleton of a flying animal that should not have been able to fly. The species was named Quetzalcoatlus northropi, after the Mesoamerican feathered serpent deity Quetzalcoatl, and after John Knudsen Northrop, the aeronautical engineer who designed flying wing aircraft. The wingspan estimate, refined over 5 decades of analysis, settled at 10 to 11 meters. Some early estimates ran higher, up to 15 meters. But the most recent reconstructions, published by Kevin Padian, Matthew Brown, and colleagues in 2021 in a comprehensive memoir of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, place the wingspan at 10 to 11 meters, and the standing height at 4.5 to 5.5 meters at the shoulder. For perspective, a 10-meter wingspan is comparable to that of a Cessna 172. Standing height of 5 meters places Quetzalcoatlus at eye level with a giraffe. Estimated mass, 200 to 250 kilograms. It was the largest flying animal in the history of life on Earth. The flight mechanics of Quetzalcoatlus generated nearly 20 years of scientific argument. The fundamental problem is that birds with wingspans approaching 7 meters, the largest known albatrosses and condors, already operate near the upper aerodynamic limit for powered flight. Adding 3 more meters of wingspan and quadrupling the body mass should have made flight impossible. For decades, some researchers argued Quetzalcoatlus was flightless, a giant terrestrial pterosaur reduced to walking the late Cretaceous floodplains. The 2021 monograph closed that debate. Detailed analysis of the wing musculature, bone density, and joint articulation confirmed that Quetzalcoatlus was capable of powered flight. The takeoff mechanism was the key. Unlike birds, which launch using their hind legs, Quetzalcoatlus launched using all 4 limbs in a quadrupedal vault, a forward-leaping motion that propelled the animal upward in a single explosive movement, after which the wings could begin generating lift. Modern biomechanical models suggest takeoff acceleration peaked at over 4g, sustained for less than half a second. The animal essentially pole vaulted into the air. Cruise flight, once airborne, was efficient. Quetzalcoatlus was almost certainly a soaring specialist, exploiting thermal updrafts over the late Cretaceous western interior plains in the same way modern condors and storks exploit thermals over the African savanna. Flight speeds estimated at 80 to 130 kilometers per hour, daily range potentially exceeding 500 kilometers. The animal could have crossed continents in a few weeks of sustained flight if motivated. Its anatomy on the ground was equally strange. Quetzalcoatlus walked quadrupedally, with the wings folded along its sides, and the wing fingers, the elongated 4th digits that supported the membrane, tucked back. The forelimbs in walking posture were configured similarly to those of a modern bat on the ground, but scaled up to giraffe proportions. The neck was long, slender, and topped by a skull nearly 3 meters in length. The jaws were elongated, toothless, and pointed. Stork-like, but at 5 times the size of any living stork. What it ate is debated. Earlier reconstructions portrayed Quetzalcoatlus as a scavenger, soaring over Cretaceous landscapes searching for dinosaur carcasses. More recent analysis, including micro-wear studies of the jaw and comparative anatomy with modern stork relatives, suggests it was probably a terrestrial predator of small to medium animals. Small dinosaurs, mammals, lizards, and amphibians, taken with stabbing strikes of the long beak. The animal stalked the Cretaceous floodplains the way a heron stalks a marsh, except it was the size of a giraffe and could fly. The environment Quetzalcoatlus inhabited was the late Cretaceous interior of North America, roughly 68 to 66 million years ago. The climate was warm and seasonal. The landscape was a mosaic of open floodplains, river channels, and ferny wetlands, with conifer forests on higher ground. The temperature on a summer afternoon would have been in the mid-30s Celsius. The smell would have been the layered organic profile of any tropical floodplain. Vegetation, mud, animal droppings, the metallic note of fresh water carrying suspended sediment. The sound would have been heavy with insects and the calls of small dinosaurs in the underbrush. The visual experience of seeing Quetzalcoatlus aloft would have been almost incomprehensible to a modern human. A 10-meter wingspan crossing the sky at low altitude casts a shadow the size of a small aircraft. The flap rate of a soaring pterosaur this size, when it did flap, would have been roughly 1 cycle every 3 to 4 seconds. Slow, deliberate strokes visible from kilometers away. The animal would not have moved like a bird. It would have moved like something operating at a different scale entirely. Closer to a glider than an albatross. The takeoff itself would have been even more striking. A quadrupedal vault that lifted 250 kilograms into the air with an explosive crack of membrane snapping taut against the wind. Quetzalcoatlus went extinct in the Cretaceous-Paleogene mass extinction 66 million years ago. The asteroid impact at Chicxulub ended the pterosaur lineage entirely. Not a single species survived. The flying reptiles had dominated aerial ecosystems for 160 million years, and the group ended in a single geological instant. Birds inherited the sky. Why no flying animal since has approached the size of Quetzalcoatlus is a question with multiple answers. Birds have a fundamentally different respiratory and skeletal architecture, optimized for sustained flapping flight rather than soaring. The largest flying birds in history, the extinct teratorns of South America, with wingspans up to 7 meters, never approached pterosaur scale. The ecological niche Quetzalcoatlus occupied may simply no longer exist. The Cretaceous floodplains supported prey densities and thermal landscapes that the post-impact world has not reproduced. What stays with you about Quetzalcoatlus is the contradiction. Everything about the animal seems to violate the constraints of vertebrate biology. The wingspan is too large. The mass is too high. The takeoff mechanics are too violent. The neck is too long. The head too disproportionate. The entire architecture too improbable. And yet, it existed. The bones are real. The flight worked. For tens of millions of years, this animal soared over Texas and across the Cretaceous interior, doing something no living creature has done since. The sky was not always what it is now. The sky used to hold things we cannot match. Finale. 10 animals, 10 separate experiments in scale, in armor, in venom, in jaw mechanics, in flight, in the limits of what a body can be. What links them is not size. The largest dinosaurs were larger than several entries on this list. What links them is that each of these species pushed a particular evolutionary architecture to a point modern biology no longer permits. A dragonfly the size of a hawk. A millipede the size of a car. A snake the weight of a horse. A shark the length of a bus. A flying reptile with the wingspan of a small aircraft. Each of these animals was the product of an Earth that was different. Sometimes the difference was atmospheric, more oxygen, more carbon dioxide, different temperatures. Sometimes it was ecological, empty niches, absent competitors, unfilled food webs. Sometimes it was geographic, vanished continents, drowned coastlines, river systems that no longer exist. The animals were not impossible. They were appropriate. Their environments produced them, and when those environments shifted, the animals could not be sustained. The implication is uncomfortable. The blueprints are not gone. They are dormant. The genetic architecture for giant arthropods, for armored fish, for serpents larger than anything alive today, much of it persists, scaled down, in living lineages. What suppresses these designs is the current configuration of the planet. Change the configuration, and some of these architectures could be expressed again. Not these specific species, those are gone permanently. But the body plans that produce them remain latent, waiting for conditions that may or may not return. We tend to think of extinction as final and total. It is final for the individual species. It is not always final for the design. Evolution is conservative. It reuses what works. The question is whether the conditions of the next several million years will demand giants again, or whether the modern compromise, smaller bodies, faster reproduction, behavioral complexity, will hold. Earth has been a planet of monsters more often than not. The last 10,000 years, the era of human civilization, are an anomaly. We grew up in one of the quietest moments in vertebrate history. After the megafauna of the Pleistocene collapsed, and before whatever comes next. The animals we share the planet with today are the survivors of a long process of size reduction. The largest predators of the last 500 million years are not in our oceans. They are in our museums. If you want to see what a planet at full biological scale looks like, you cannot look out a window. You have to look down, into the rock, where the bones are. If this video kept you to the end, subscribe. The channel covers the deep history of life on Earth, and there is much more to come. The megafauna of the last ice age, the strangest extinctions science still cannot explain. the ecosystems that built the world before ours. And in the comments, answer this. Of the 10 animals on this list, which one would you most want to see alive? And which one would you least want to encounter? The answers say more about us than about them. Thanks for watching. I worked really hard on this. Bye, everyone.